What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Canadian Football Fantasy Fix. I'm Ryan Coop here with your full Grey Cup CFL Fantasy preview for 2021. Yes, one video for this week previewing everything to do with CFL Fantasy for the Grey Cup. I'll go through the depth charts, those are out. I'll go through all of your positional previews as well. Normally, I split this up into different videos each and every week, but I figured there's one game. There's really only two options to a lot of these positions this week. I figure it doesn't make sense to split that all out into separate videos. So you get it all here, all at once to help you set your lineups for the final time this season. Wow, can't believe this season has come and gone. What a fantastic year it's been. It's been a real fun year doing the Canadian Football Fantasy Fix here, and of course a lot of fun stuff I have planned this off season and coming back into next year as well. So before I dive into things for your preview for this week, just a heads up on video schedule coming out in the next little bit. Early next week, I will have a bit of a channel update and let you know on some of my off-season plans for what we're going to do here to keep things going, because I don't want the season to end and this channel to just disappear until CFL Fantasy next year. No, I want to keep chatting CFL Fantasy football and other things CFL related here with you. So that will continue, and I'll have more on that early next week. And late next week, we're going to wrap up the 2021 season with the CFL Fantasy Awards. The CFL Awards show just took place last week, I think yesterday actually, at the time of recording this. And those cover the major awards from the week. I want to make my own CFL Fantasy Awards. We'll award, most valuable player for the price, most consistent fantasy player at each position, things like that. So come back here late next week and look forward to that wrap up. Now let's get into the Grey Cup preview. Winnipeg and Hamilton rematch of 2019. It should be a great game. Let's start with the depth charts. On the Bombers side of things, it's the same starters all across the board as last week. The only changes for them, a couple of backups, Tui Eli and Mike Jones, both not ready to go and not able to play in this game. But the starting crew is all the same as usual. Zach Collaros at quarterback, Andrew Harris at running back, receivers Darvin Adams, Rasheed Bailey, Nick Dembski, Kenny Lawler, and Drew Wolotarski. Punt returner and kick returner Janarian Grant. On the Hamilton side of the matchup, things are a little bit different this week. There is a change of starting quarterback, and that's a surprise to nobody after his outstanding performance in the East Final. Dane Evans gets the start at quarterback for the Ticats over Jeremiah Mazzoli for this Grey Cup. There is still no Braylon Addison on offense. He is still out this game, so they have the same offense besides Dane Evans as last week. Don Jackson starts at running back. At receiver, it's Stephen Dunbar Jr., Jalen Acklin, Brandon Banks, Tim White, David Ungerer III, and then Poppy White being the primary kick returner for the Ticats this week. On the defensive side of the ball, they'll be without Ted Laurent on the defensive line, which is a big hole there for them. Autry II fills in for him at that position. And then a bit of shuffling on the defensive backfield in this game. A lot of guys changing positions. Looks like Desmond Lawrence is not ready to, or is not in the lineup this week. And Stavros Katsantonis gets the start at safety. So a bit of shuffling there in the defensive backfield for Hamilton. But by and large, for most of these teams, the same lineup as last week. Now we get into the positional previews here. Let's start off with the quarterback position. Now, normally, as we go through each position here on the Canadian Football Fantasy Fix, we take a look at the options based on their price values. Taking a look, what do you need to get 2.5 points per $1,000, which is what I consider full value. We're still going to do that on the receivers because I think there's a lot of discrepancy there. But on the other positions here, look, like quarterback, you really only have two options. You're either taking Zach Collaros or you're taking Dane Evans this week. I guess there's a third option of you're taking nobody, but that's certainly a potential strategy, I guess. But of the two potential options to put in your lineup, it's going to be these two. You're not going to take Mazzoli as a backup. Maybe you feel wild and crazy and want to go with Sean McGuire and bank on him getting 2 rushing touchdowns. I wouldn't necessarily do that myself. So it comes down to these two guys. So let's take a look at the options, Collaros or Evans. Both pretty much the exact same price, $8,743 for Collaros, $85.98 for Evans. On Collaros' side of things, played 14 games this year, averaged just under 15 points in those games. Most of his games, he's been pretty consistent in the 10 to 19 point range. He did hit over 20 a couple of times this year and had a couple of games of less than 10, but not a bad year, certainly, by the league's most outstanding player. The last 5 games for him, 14.4 against Edmonton in Week 11. He had a strong performance of 22.7 against BC in Week 12, 19.2 against the Alouettes in Week 14. Only 2.9 points against Calgary in Week 16, but he did only play about a quarter and a bit of that game. So certainly it would have been a higher total if he played all week. And then the disappointing 7.2 last game against the Riders, where he threw a couple of interceptions. Only some of them his fault early in that game. He faces the Ticats defense that's averaged 16.5 points. Again, quarterbacks have put up on average 16.5 against them this season. On the other side, you have Dane Evans, who has only started 3 games this year, weeks 4 to 6, putting up an average of 16.5 points in those 3 games. All 3 games coming in the 10 to 19 point range. He has had a couple of games where he's made meaningful contributions as a backup as well. Those are not listed in here because these stats go based off just of starts. But he did have a game. Backup quarterback had 2 rushing touchdowns, put up 13 points against Ottawa. Last week's performance against Toronto also not included in here because he was the backup, but he did come in, I think, early second quarter in that game, put up 27.4 points, went a perfect 100% passing in that game, a couple rushing touchdowns and passing touchdown. Massive day for Dane Evans there. Faces the Winnipeg defense that's been by far the toughest against quarterbacks. They average just 11.6 points against them. So when choosing between these two guys, it's a tough pick, I think, especially because they're both facing 2 of the top defenses in the CFL, which should be no surprise why these teams are in the Grey Cup. I like Collaros here a little bit more of a play. Because the Bombers' defense has been so stingy against quarterbacks. It's really tough to put up offensive touchdowns against them, big games there. I think Collaros has, been kind of stuck in that sweet spot of consistently putting you up. He's put up a lot of games of in the 15 to 20 point range up for you. I like the play here of Collaros against Hamilton's defense a little bit more. Some of the concerns I have with Hamilton is big if on this, if they start slow, are we going to see Orlando Steinauer make the same switch, the inverse switch of he did last week, and put Jeremiah Mazzoli back in if they need a spark? Because certainly you don't want to end up with a quarterback on the sidelines. That's what happened to me last week. I took Mazzoli and it screwed over my fantasy matchup, and I lost in the semifinals of my league, unfortunately, as a result. Whereas, even if he's struggling, Collaros is playing this whole game, barring injury. So, with the price being so similar, I think I like Collaros a little bit more as your quarterback option for the Grey Cup. Moving into the running backs, it really comes down to Andrew Harris or Don Jackson. There are, of course, other running backs that have had good performances this year. On Winnipeg's side, you've got Brady Oliveira, you've got Johnny Augustine, who have made some contributions this season. Hamilton's side, you've got Sean Thomas Erlington. Heck, you even have Jackson Bennett's gotten in a couple times this year. But These are the main guys starting. I think it's got to be one of these two guys you take this week. I don't think any of those others are going to make enough of a contribution to be worth your money. And so it comes down to these two at running back. Again, both similarly priced. This time it's the Bomber guy that's a little bit cheaper. Andrew Harris about $200 cheaper than Don Jackson. Harris has played 8 games this year and averaged 16.3 points in that time. He had a couple games over 20 points, including one over 30. Most of his games coming in that 10 to 19 point range, and he did have one earlier in the year. I think was around 9 points, just under 10. You can see his last 5 games there. A bit of up and down, 15.3, 11.3, that big 30.4, then an 11.4, and a huge 21.5 point performance in that Western final against the Riders last week. He faces a Hamilton team that running backs on average score 14.8 against them. So a bit of a tougher matchup there. But they are, as I mentioned, missing Ted Laurent, which is a big part of their run defense, which maybe opens the hole up a little more here for Andrew Harris. On the other side of the matchup, you have Don Jackson, $8,338. He's played 6 games this year. This includes one earlier in the season where he was as a backup, got a couple carries, but really didn't do a whole ton. And that factors into a season average of 13.5 points. Most of his games also in the 10 to 19 point range, and then that one game earlier in the year less than 10. But the last 5 games since he's taken over as the starter, he's put up some very solid numbers here. Hasn't broken the 20 point mark, but he's put up 17 to 18 points in 3 of them. And then the past 2 games, 14.1 and 12.9. Faces a Bombers defense where running backs average 16.3 points. So which of these options do I like a little bit better this game? I like Andrew Harris. I think Andrew Harris, we know he's a guy that can come in and dominate and take over a game. And we know the Bombers are a team that likes to be a very run-heavy offense. And especially if they can get a lead early on in this game, you're going to see a healthy dose of Andrew Harris, much like you did in the Grey Cup last year, much like we did in the West Final last week, where I think he had something like 20-something carries in that game. I think that's an important part of the Bombers to get the run game going early, especially if there's that hole on the defensive line for the Ticats. I think I like Harris here a little bit more. Don Jackson, I'm always a bit concerned. Are you going to see a couple of the receivers come in and get some carries? Maybe Sean Thomas Erlington factors into there a little bit. And I could see them maybe being a team that, is willing to go more pass heavy here. So I like Harris slightly more than I like Don Jackson here, but I think either of them, honestly, is a good play this week and are really your only 2 running back options. Then we get into receivers, and we go back to our bread and butter here of taking a look team by team and seeing, based on their price, based on their production this season and their matchup, whether or not they are a good value play. You can see they're 2.5 times this 2.5 points per $1,000 is that 2.5x column. That's kind of how we deem whether they're a good pick or not. Because the price ranges vary so much. Let's start with the Bombers and then go to the Ticats. Kenny Lawler is the most expensive at $8,520. To get your full value out of him, you need 21.3 points. He's averaged 15 on the season. I think it's been a little up and down for him as of late, though. For Kenny Lawler, it has been, a 7.9 points last week in the West Final against Saskatchewan. A couple games before that, he was in the 8-point range. Granted, those were late in the season when the Bombers had the season wrapped up. I think given that there's no good cheap plays at quarterback or running back this week, I think the price for me is just too high on Lawler. I think there are other better options where you can save some money here on the Bombers side. And those 2 options I potentially like are Rashid Bailey and Nick Dembski. I do like both of them as plays this week if you can find the way to fit them in money-wise. And that's why they're a yellow light for me. I think Dembski in particular has been one of the most consistent receivers in the CFL this season. Take out, the last 2 games of the year where it was a backup quarterback in for the most part. He's had 1 game under 10 points, and everything else has been above 10 for him, and he's had a lot of games in that 10 to 15 point range, which is just short of your full value. He's had a couple of games in the 18 to 19 point range as well. I really like Nick Dembski. I like how he gets in. He doesn't get a ton of receptions necessarily, but he's got good touchdown potential, and he's very involved in the run game as well for a receiver, which is good to see him pick up some yards there. And, the Bombers are going to bring their A game in the Grey Cup. So will Hamilton, presumably. Hopefully both teams do. And for the Bombers, I think their A game involves getting a healthy dose of Nick Dembski. So I like that play. I also like Rasheed Bailey, who is actually vaulted over Dembski in price at this point. He had the best performance of a Bomber receiver in the West Final. Put up 15.4 points in that range. For him, he has had a fantastic year. Take out again those late season games that didn't mean a whole ton. His last 4 games, 15.4, 8.6, 14.4, 22.5, and then you go back another 3 games before that, and they were all over 10 points there as well. So a very good season here for Rasheed Bailey. I like him and his involvement in that offense. I'm saying stay away from Darvin Adams at $5,689. He's averaged just 8.5 points a game this year. Last week made some key catches in that West Final, but only put up 6.2 points as a result of that. More often than not, he's not getting the catches he needs to be your big game receiver that's going to get you your money's worth at the receiver position. And then 2 potential cheaper plays. I give them yellow lights just because, if you're going along the same lines I just talked about with quarterback and running back, you're going to need some cheaper plays at receiver. And these guys, I think, have potential to be worthy picks for you. Drew Wolotarski at $4,081. You need 10.2 points to get your full value. He's averaged half of that this year at 5.4. Most weeks, it is going to be a bit of a disappointment value-wise here for Drew Wolotarski. His last 3 games, 3.1, 3.8, 4.2. But he has had a couple games this year. He had 2 games over 10 points. He had a couple games in the 9-point range. So there's been times this year where he's come close. He gets a couple catches his way, a couple targets usually each and every game. That he could make it worth your while at that spot. And then the final Bomber here, Janarian Grant, kick returner, $3,589. You need 9 points. He only hit that once this year when he did get a return touchdown against BC in Week 12. But in the other games he's played, he's averaged 4 or 5 points around that range as well. So also likely not to hit you your full value necessarily. Of what you're hoping for, but a guy that could, put a decent floor of points up for you and come just a couple points shy of what you need there if you really need to save some cash. Then we get to the Hamilton side of the matchup. Again, no Braylon Addison once again this week. For the Ticats, I think almost all of their starting receivers are intriguing plays here. I don't like the very cheap options, unfortunately. David Unger, Tyler Tanowski, Nikola Kalinic, none of them put up, remotely consistent points to be worth the real cheap play here for me. But then we get into the main receivers we see utilized by Hamilton. Brandon Banks is the most expensive at $7,272. You need 18.2 points out of him. He's averaged 12 points a game on the year. Last 5 games for him, 22.1, 14.5, 12.4, 16.8, and 9.3. So he's had a couple games of at least 2 points per $1,000 there for you. This is a big game for Brandon Banks. He's been here to the Grey Cup a couple of times with Hamilton, has yet to take home the hardware, and this is going to be a big game for him, and I think he's going to be a guy that Ticats really need to get going here in this game. So I do like the play potentially of Banks. The concern is there that maybe he doesn't hit his value, and the concern is the high price, which is why it's not a green light there for me either. but I think that's a potentially good play. Same thing, Tim White, 11.4 points. He comes in at a similar salary. 11.4 is his average. He had a very solid stretch of games this year. It's trailed off in the 2 playoff games here so far, though. 9.4 and 7.5 in the last 2 for him. We've seen him put up points in the 15 to 16 point range a number of times throughout the season, but more often than not, we're seeing points in the 10-ish to 12 point range in recent history for Tim White. So a bit cautious on that play. Always a guy, big play potential there, but not necessarily a lock for me. Jalen Acklin is one of the more intriguing ones. Had the big game last week, I think the biggest game among receivers, and put up 25.2 points. You need 16.8 at his salary. In his one game against Winnipeg earlier this year, that was his best game prior to this, where he put up 22.8. He's had a couple big games this year, over 20 points. In the past 3, he's put up over 10 points in each of those. Acklin seems like there was some chemistry there between him and Dane Evans, which is interesting to me because coming into this, his best games this year were with Mazzoli at the helm, not Evans. So that kind of made me a little skeptical there. I think he is one of the strongest plays at receiver here, though, this week, if you can fit him in your lineup, especially if they can make magic happen like they did last week. But there is always concern, the Bombers don't give up a ton of passing touchdowns. They don't give up a ton of passing yards, which makes it hard to necessarily absolutely lock in any of these Hamilton receivers. Stephen Dunbar Jr. is one of the cheaper, more affordable options. You need 12.5. He averages 9.9 on the year. Earlier this season, at that salary, I would have locked him in absolutely. He had a stretch of 4 of 6 games where he was hitting full value, 5 of 7 even, where he was doing that as well. The past 2 games for him, though, 0 and 7.1, so it's been a bit of a letdown there. I think he is one of the options I like more this week, just because you're going to be finding it tough to fit 2 receivers in, one in the regular slot, one in the flex, at expensive prices. So I do like Stephen Dunbar Jr. as a potential play here for Hamilton. And I like Poppy White as the cheapest receiver option that I think is viable. 8.3 points is what you want at his $3,331 salary. He averages 7.4 on the year. Had a big return touchdown last week and put up 11.4 points. Much like Janarian Grant, typically probably not going to break you a huge week. Just from return usage alone, but we do see him sometimes rotate into the offense, and I think if you're comparing the 2 the kick returners, Janarian Grant or Poppy White, I think I like White a little bit more because we've seen more success from the Ticats in that regard, and we've seen the Bombers give up some big returns this season. So he's a guy I'm strongly considering putting in my own lineup this week as a cheap receiver play. Now let's get into the defense. And your 2 options here are, of course, the Bombers defense or the Ticats. There is a decent discrepancy in price here between the 2. The Bombers are at $4,650. In the 15 games they've played this year, they've averaged 11.8 points. A couple over 20, a good chunk of them in that 10 to 19 range. And then some disappointing games as well of under 10 points for them. In their last 5, they had a big one against BC in Week 12, and then it's been kind of a slowdown for them. Their average has definitely decreased down the stretch here. Of course, those 3 games in the middle, kind of meaningless games, defense resting for good chunks of most of those. But 8, 4, 7, and 8 in their last 4 games for the Bombers. They face a Ticats team that gives up on average 6.3. On the other side of things, you have Hamilton's defense, 3,474. 16 games this year, they've averaged 9.3 points. none over 20. They've got 6 in that 10 to 19 point range, and then 10 games this year under 10 points. They have had in their past few some very good days, 15, 18, and 9 in their past 3 games. The only problem for me, they face the Bombers offense, who does typically not give up a massive number of points. They don't give up very many sacks. Typically, they don't turn over the ball a ton, although Collaros did last week. So 4.3 points is what you get against the Bombers from a defense regularly. So this is a tough one for me because I like the Bombers defense here a lot better. I think based on the matchup of, like I said, the Bombers don't give up very many sacks. They come to play very well. I think, Dane Evans against the Bombers defense, I like that better than I like the Ticats defense against Collaros a little bit, especially with Ted Laurent missing. Maybe much better was not fair to the Ticats. I think it's closer. I would lean, though, to the Bombers having a better day defensively here. It then comes down to price. What can you fit in your lineup? Certainly, I think if you can fit them in your lineup, I go Bombers here. If not, I think Hamilton's still not a bad play here, though, potentially. They've shown in the playoffs here that they're capable of making some big plays on defense, and it should be a tight game here between these two squads, so I don't think you can go wrong with either of these defensive options. Well, that does it for your positional preview for the Grey Cup. Tough week, I think, price-wise. Quarterback, running back, not really any options to save much money there. Maybe you can save some on defense, go with the Ticats, and then you got to, make some plays at receiver. You're probably going to need to go for a cheaper receiver, and there unfortunately is none of the cheap $2,500 variety that's going to be a worthy big play here for you this week. So best of luck with this week. Enjoy the Grey Cup. I hope it's going to be a fantastic game, and what a great season it has been. As I mentioned off the top, stay tuned early next week. I'll have a bit of an update on my off-season plans here with the Canadian Football Fantasy Fix. And then later on next week, we'll go through the first inaugural Canadian Football Fantasy Fix CFL Fantasy Awards and hand out some made-up awards to different teams and players based on their performances this season, which should be a lot of fun as well. Do all the YouTube things, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you liked, what you didn't. If you have any fantasy questions, put them in the comments section or tweet them at me at CooperTrooper42. Link there is in the description. And as I wrap things up here, I just want to say, first of all, thank you very much to everybody who has tuned in throughout all of these previews all season. I've gotten a lot of absolutely over-the-top nice feedback on it, which has been very kind. And I'm happy to hear people have been enjoying this content and it has been useful to them. And as I mentioned, stay tuned. Lots of fun stuff coming throughout the off-season here as well. You can get updates on all of that both here on the channel and on Twitter from my Twitter account, as I mentioned. Enjoy the Grey Cup this weekend. Best of luck if you're playing in any CFL Fantasy Finals. And all the best to you there. And we'll talk to you early next week. As always, thanks for watching. Take care. Have a good one. Bye.